Welcome to this tutorial for installing DataWharf locally on your machine. First step is to go to the official DataWharf GitHub repo. You can simply go to datawharf.org, which will redirect you to the GitHub DataWharf repo. From there, scroll down until you can see running a demo of DataWharf using Docker. We have a first overview section, which will explain to you the steps we're actually going to be demonstrating, or simply go to the step-by-step instructions section. From there, select Instructions to install DataWharf using Docker. Once you are on that list, let's check what are our prerequisites. We will be using Docker Desktop. Even though Docker Desktop can run on Mac, Linux, and Windows, for the purpose of this tutorial, we are going to be focusing on Microsoft Windows. On this machine, I am going to be using Windows 11. The next step we'll also have to create is an empty database under a PostgreSQL server. And then we will do the actual install of DataWharf using Docker. The first step, installation of Docker Desktop. Docker Desktop is free for personal use and for small businesses, fewer than 250 employees and less than 10 million annual revenue. Otherwise, you may want to subscribe for a small team subscription, which is less than, I believe, $10 a month per person if you are in a large company. On Mac, you could actually use Lima, which is another open source project, which could allow you to run Docker on your local Mac. Under Windows, we will need to actually install the Windows Subsystem for Linux, also known as WSL. Both WSL and Docker Desktop guide of how to install can be seen following this guide, installing and using WSL Docker Desktop. This guide was actually created for developers who would like to contribute to DataWharf or other Harbor projects. And in this case, you do not need to follow all the steps. You do not need to install VS Code or the Harbor compiler. You only need to follow the installing WSL step and the installing Docker Desktop. Both of those sections have complete step-by-step instructions with print screens, so you will know exactly what to do. I will not go through the installation during this tutorial since it is already installed on my machine. The next step is to install PostgreSQL. On this machine, I actually have a few different versions of PostgreSQL, but let's install the latest version. Step 1, download one of the latest versions. We can directly select the latest non-release candidate or beta. And this is the file that normally it would propose to install. I had already downloaded previously, so I can simply execute it. I run as admin, so I don't have to worry about access rights or prompt being done. Let me actually go back to the step-by-step guide. While the installer is initializing, which may take a few seconds since it's verifying if it has enough resources. And here we are. Next, you can use the default location to install the PostgreSQL server, which, by the way, on Windows is going to be a service running on a certain port. Next, we need to select components. You will need the PostgreSQL server itself and the command line tools, which are a requirement actually. So I'm not exactly certain why it is an optional selection here. You do not need the stack builder. You would only need it if you, for example, want to install an ODBC driver or some advanced PostgreSQL extensions, which we don't need for DataWharf. And for the PG admin, which is a tool that is used to graphically manage your servers across versions and across locations, you would install PG admin Since I already have it on this machine, I don't need to install it again. We can leave the default folder where it's going to store the data files, where your SQL database files are going to be stored. Next step is actually to set up the password for the admin or also super user account. Since your install of PostgreSQL is going to be only running locally, and by default, it's not being open to external machines, you do not have to create very complex password. In my case, I'm simply using main for my password for the Postgres super user. Next is to select a port. If this is your first install and you don't have any other instances of Postgres running as a service, you probably will see 5432. In this case, I will select another port number, kind of reminding me I'm on 15. So put a 5 to remember port. You can stay with the local to be basically running on my machine in English. And we have a confirmation about all the items that are going to be installed. You may want to store those little notepad file just to remember and start the install process. Now, this install process will take several minutes, so I will actually pause this recording while this is going on. Resuming the recording and the setup application of the setup of the PostgreSQL server completed. And we are done with setting up your local instance of PostgreSQL. The next would be to create an empty database. Please launch your PG admin tool, which you should find in your start menu. You may already have a grouping that already exists. In this case, I'm trying to keep all the different servers I'm accessing under their own group. You can create a new server group if you want to. You need to right click on the already existing list server group. And I'm going to Postgres. Team. So I can remember the different versions I have. And from there, I'm going to register a server. In this case, localhost 15. Again, so I remember I'm using version 15 of PostgreSQL. You can name your local instance whomever you wish. Next is to go to connections. This is where you really have to specify localhost, since we installed PostgreSQL locally. Update your port if needed. And we have the default user to use when you connect. This is where I will type in the password I use when I set up the install, and I can save my password. Again, security is not too much of an issue since we are running this locally and it's not being opened to the install. And we are connected. Once we are connected, you can see we have one database. It's called a Postgres database. Please do not delete this database. It is its own database that keeps track of all the elements that you have in your cluster. That's what we call your server here. And we right-click, create a database. And let's call it DataWharf, for example, demo. Since we are accessing, I can see that I had a little error because we had a previous version of DataWharf installed here. And we try DataWharf demo 2. Okay. I guess I had another number 2 as well. We have an empty database located here. We can leave pgadmin running in case you would like to see what DataWharf created for you later on. All of these steps I went through, they're all listed here. Next, we will install DataWharf itself. You start Docker. Well, in this case, I already have Docker desktop running. And let's go to a command prompt and create a folder, for example, DataWharf Docker. I actually already have your make directory of DataWharf Docker folder. I'm going to go to that directory, and I currently have no files. Next step is you will copy, download two particular files. One is a Docker file itself, which is like a script file to know how Docker is going to build an image. And another one is a configuration file that this particular Docker is going to load in to know how to configure and to connect to your database, and or you can use to do some configurations like colors and titles that you would like to do. You right click and you can open simply File and use the download raw file. So this is actually a very small Docker file, which relies on a pre-built Docker image available from Docker Hub, which is a service provided by Docker, the company, where the latest version of DataWharf is always being maintained for you. When you download the file, depending on some browsers, it may actually add the extension .txt. Let's remove that extension to ensure we don't have one file downloaded. Let's get the next one. And even though I removed .txt, it still re-added it. This might be because we're using Firefox here. All right. Additionally, you may want to download one more file. Locate a file that starts with export data dictionary underscore DataWharf, a timestamp, and .zip. And let's download it and copy it in the same folder. This is going to be a backup or an export from a version of the documentation of DataWharf itself. I previously used DataWharf to document itself, all of its own tables. This can be a great way for you to view the kind of information you can maintain in the application side of DataWharf. Right? Let's go back to our step-by-step guide. Actually, I stepped away from it. Let's go back to it. We copy these two files. Warning, some browser may add an extend.txt. So we can either go and remove that file, or at the next step, step 9, we change a little bit the comment to actually specify .txt, which for now will do simply that. Let's edit in our DataWharf Docker file. Let's view them actually. So we have the three files here. Let's edit this particular file. By the way, in Windows, like in Linux, once you start to type a beginning of a file, you can hit Tab to complete the rest of the file name. That's how it came. Next, we need to update, in this case, the port. This the host in Docker, host.docker internal is the equivalent of localhost. So Docker needs to know how to reach a local host outside of a Docker container. A login to actually access your database. Now, in this case, I simply use Postgres. We have the main password and the database. I believe we use DataWharf demo 3. We can change the title if you want to, change the colors. If you change any of these, you will always need to rebuild your Docker image. So please do so before we call Docker build. The security salt, you can leave it like this. It is basically to help the encryption of user account passwords. And the default password is going to be used for the first account being created, which is a main account in DataWharf, which will have root access to DataWharf itself. The rest you can leave the way it is. Save changes. Next step. Let's verify we don't already have containers of DataWharf itself running. So in my case, I know they're not there. If you had some, let's say you install a new version, or you want to get a new version, meaning you need to build a new version of the image, ensure you first stop Docker. This is how you would do Docker stop, and then under container ID, there will be a number, which will be a container number or ID. The instructions mention that particular step, Docker stop. Next, we need to build an image of Docker. So this is a command we'll use, but we'll alter it a little bit since we have a .txt that was added. So this is the file, Docker file demo using Docker Hub Ubuntu .txt. And we'll execute this. It may take a little while on your machine the first time, since it may have to download a base image for Docker itself. On my machine, I think some of those images were already downloaded, so it may be much faster. Actually, it's already completed. And the next is actually to run Docker, the image that was created. So an image is kind of like a drive being all set, and the container is an instance of it running, meaning we're going to be actually have DataWharf executing. DataWharf is using Ubuntu. It's running an Apache server internally and a fastCGI exe, which is a DataWharf application itself. We have it mapped to use your local host port 8080 to point inside the container to use port 80. If you want to use a different port on your side, you can change the first one. This is going to initiate Docker container. Next step is we actually will go and test it. Let's do browser and port 8080, which redirects you to DataWharf. And I believe it's main password. And we are in DataWharf. First time we logged in on this machine. And by the way, localhost on this machine is set up like this. What I would recommend to do is actually create a first application. We don't have any application. We don't have any projects. Let's actually create an application of DataWharf itself. This is where the previously maintained documentation of DataWharf can be loaded and appear as one of the application. Go to Settings, Application, New Application, DataWharf documentation, for example. We need to give a link code, which is a code used in the URLs to access any part of your DataWharf instance. Destructive delete, since this is just some documentation, I will allow to actually delete the entire application. Otherwise, to delete anything in DataWharf, you have to delete any child record first. Well, here we have columns, tables, namespaces, indexes, enumerations. It will take you a long time to remove this particular application. And since we're just doing import, we don't have to worry too much about what we do with this. So we have set up an application. We can go to the application itself. Here's DataWharf documentation. And let's go to import. Once we import, let's go and pick up that particular zip file we downloaded to the DataWharf Docker folder. This will be additive. It will add all of its entries, but since we have nothing, we can just rerun this on top. And we have 55 files, enumerations, namespaces, tags. So these are actually the internal table the DataWharf is using to execute itself with documentation about all of them. And you can actually go to visualize and actually see the documentation. Now I have several diagrams. So if I want to see the data or the application data dictionary modeling tool, you can see the list of tables. And by the way, you can also use, first of all, since the browser, you could use Control minus and plus to make your screen bigger or smaller. And you can also go to My Settings to change the size of your canvas to the left. That is where all the diagrams are located. Since we did run this, let's actually go and do a refresh on the database. And we go to schemas, public, tables, and all those files that we were listed before. There were 55, actually 54 in the public schema. There's one more in a schema called volatile. They're all here. So DataWharf automatically creates all of its tables and columns to support itself. And anytime a new version of DataWharf is executed, it's going to autofix its own schema. Here we have it. We did a complete install of DataWharf locally. If you need to install this on a server, you may want to use a Kubernetes environments, for example, to run these Docker images for you. Or you could go by the step-by-step process of installing all the source code and building the executables, setting up Apache, but this is quite time-consuming. There are guides for how to set those up in the harbor.wiki website if you care to do so. Again, the easiest is simply to run the DataWharf application, which is a fast CGI app, inside Docker itself, and simply have it point to an external instance of a PostgreSQL server. I hope this tutorial will help you to test out and try out or use DataWharf in your organization. Thank you so much.